I walked into the restaurant trying to disappear into the background, hoping the high ceilings, sparkling chandeliers, and polished marble floors would swallow me whole. Coronado, California, wasn't exactly my natural habitat. The scent of the ocean mixed with designer perfume hung in the air, and every table seemed like a stage where the wealthy performed their wealth with practiced ease. I tightened the collar of my charcoal gray suit, an understated piece that I had spent more on than I cared to admit, yet somehow it felt inadequate in this setting. My goal tonight was simple: be invisible, just one night, just one dinner before Marcus's graduation. But I knew better. In my family, invisibility was impossible. My parents had spent the last 3 decades building their version of perfection. My father, David Hayes, a retired Navy senior chief petty officer, had always equated success with discipline, honor, and the flawless performance of his children. My mother, Janelle, had married into the military lifestyle, but made it her own empire of social status, appearances, and subtle, cutting commentary. Together, they were a force. And then there was Marcus, my younger brother, the golden boy, the one who could do no wrong. At 26, he had fulfilled every expectation. He was tall, built like a Greek god sculpted from a Navy brochure, and charming in a way that made people believe he was born with merit. And then there was me. Imani Hayes, 34 years old, officially a disappointment in the Hayes household. For 12 years, that title had been hammered into my identity until I could almost believe it myself. The dropout, the failure, the one who broke our father's heart. And yet here I was, paying for my own flight from DC, showing up at my brother's pre-graduation dinner, pretending that my presence meant something more than obligation. The restaurant smelled of expensive seafood, crisp linens, and the subtle trace of wealth that my family inhaled daily. The maitre d' ushered me to the table at the far corner, and I could already feel the stares, not from strangers, but from the people who had trained me to see the world as a constant judgment chamber. My mother's laugh rang across the table, brittle and high-pitched, a sound that demanded attention, designed to be overheard by the uniformed patrons nearby. She wasn't laughing at humor. She was laughing at dominance, control, superiority. "Imani," she said, her gaze sweeping over me as if I were a blemish on her carefully curated life. She didn't smile at me. She assessed, critiqued, measured every inch. She had already begun. The invisible war that had defined my childhood was now a full-blown campaign at the dinner table. Sitting next to Marcus, clinging to his arm like a delicate, expensive accessory, was Chloe. Pale, thin, and all sharp edges, she was a La Jolla heiress, a woman who knew her worth in cashmere and diamonds. Her eyes barely acknowledged me, except for an initial flicker of disdain. I could practically feel her mind analyzing me as an anomaly in the perfect family portrait she was marrying into. I was the smudge on the canvas. Marcus, of course, didn't even notice me, or at least pretended not to. He was the golden child, narrating tales of his training with the confidence of someone who had never been doubted, never questioned, never called a failure. He laughed, a sound that grated on my nerves. I had tried so hard to be supportive, to sit quietly, to be invisible, and yet, even my invisibility seemed to scream, "Look at me, judge me." Chloe was the first to strike. Leaning forward, her diamond-laden hand rested delicately on Marcus's arm. "Oh, Imani," she said, her voice a soft, sugar-coated knife. "You actually came. I am so surprised." I didn't reply. My fork hovered above the untouched scallops, growing cold as I absorbed the sting. I didn't need to ask why she was surprised. My presence was a challenge to the carefully constructed narrative of the family. The successful daughter had somehow shown up. My mother intervened immediately. "Now, Imani, don't be defensive. Chloe just meant—" "I just meant, Chloe cut in, her voice dripping with faux innocence. "I told Marcus I was sure your little job probably couldn't afford the airfare. Things are so expensive these days." Expensive? My jaw tightened. She said it as if it were an alien concept, as if she had just discovered scarcity in the world for the first time. My father's eyes narrowed across the table, watching, waiting. He loved the drama. Marcus smirked, enjoying my discomfort, the predator enjoying the panic of prey. My job, my independence, my quiet life in DC, they were all a spectacle, fodder for the amusement of the ones who had already decided my value. I spoke, my voice quiet, dangerously restrained. My job pays my bills, Chloe. Oh, I'm sure it does, she said, tittering like a wind chime designed to irritate. Fixing printers, resetting passwords, is that what you do? She turned to Marcus, batting her eyelashes, as if to say, "Look at the charity I'm bestowing on this poor soul." The insult was sharp, precise, but not unexpected. My mother smiled, tight and satisfied, her eyes glinting with the cold approval of success by comparison. "Yes, honey," she said, ignoring my voice. "This is what I mean by presentation. Look at your brother. Look at me. Look at Chloe. This is what success looks like." And in that instant, I felt the familiar burn in my neck. Shame. Anger. A heat that had accompanied me since childhood whenever my mother reminded me of my shortcomings. This was her weapon. Not the open rage of my father, but the slow, cutting death by comparison. I breathed, forcing calm. "I did not realize there was a dress code, Mom," I said flatly. "There is always a dress. Code, Imani. It's called respect," she replied, her smile never wavering. Respect for the family. Respect for Marcus. Respect for the image she wanted to project to the world. My choice of attire, my very presence, became a battlefield where every stitch, every color, every shadow of who I was became a provocation. "You just look so plain, so severe," she continued, her voice soft, cruel, precise. "Are you going to a job interview after this? Perhaps applying for welfare benefits? That's what that outfit says." My father snorted, muttering, "She wishes she could get a secretarial job." I felt the heat rise again, but I stayed seated. This was nothing new. 12 years of this, a lifetime. Yet each remark cut, deep and personal. And yet, through the sting, a quiet, stubborn ember of defiance flickered. I would not cry. I would not lash out. I would survive this, as I always had. The chapter closed not with a resolution, but with anticipation. Tomorrow, at Marcus's graduation, my presence would be tested again. And I would be ready. The dinner felt like a carefully choreographed battle I had stepped into wearing armor I didn't know I possessed. I had hoped that the lavishness of the restaurant, the glittering chandeliers, the seafood towers, the waitstaff moving silently like trained performers, would distract from the battlefield at my own table. I was wrong. There was no hiding. My family had a radar for my failures, and tonight their eyes were locked on me. Chloe leaned back in her chair, eyes still glued to me, her diamond earrings catching the light as if mocking me. Her voice was soft but lethal, the tone of someone trained to wound without leaving fingerprints. "I just meant, Imani, that I wasn't sure you'd actually come. Traveling is so hard, and with your job, you must be stretched thin." I forced myself to maintain a neutral expression. "It wasn't hard," I said evenly, letting my voice float over the table like a controlled breath. "I wanted to be here for Marcus." "Oh, sweet," Chloe said, tilting her head with that practiced sympathy of someone trained to exude concern while administering judgment. "How thoughtful." I clenched my fists beneath the table, pressing them into my thighs until my knuckles whitened. My mother, Janelle, leaned in, her eyes trained like cameras on my reactions. She was fully invested in the spectacle, in the validation of her own social prowess. "Now, Imani, don't be defensive," she said, her voice honeyed but sharp. "Chloe only meant well. Flying out here isn't easy for everyone, and I understand that." Her words weren't kind. They were calculated, a verbal patina masking derision. They implied, ever so subtly, that I was incapable, unworthy, and insufficient. And I sat there smiling politely, nodding, taking the verbal beatings like a soldier trained to endure, waiting for the inevitable next strike. Marcus laughed, loud and indulgent, clearly entertained by the circus I had become for his amusement. He didn't even need to speak. His presence alone reinforced the hierarchy. Golden child, flawless in the eyes of our parents, and me, the shadow, the cautionary tale, the one allowed to exist but never to thrive. The waiter arrived with the first course, a meticulously plated appetizer that could have been hung in a gallery. I picked at it lightly, careful not to let Chloe interpret my modest appetite as weakness. That would give her another opening, another chance to assert superiority. She was already sizing me up, calculating the social damage my mere presence might inflict on her perfect tableau. "You look tired," Chloe said, leaning across the table like a predator assessing its prey. "Long day at work, I'm guessing?" Her gaze lingered over my hands, the cuff of my suit, my wedding ring-free finger. "I just worry for you. You know, being overworked, underappreciated. It must be difficult." It was an insult wrapped in concern. I could almost see the little gears turning behind her pale blue eyes, mapping out my insecurities, testing their depth. My jaw tightened. "I manage just fine," I said, my voice calm, measured, deceptively placid. My mother intervened again, her delicate fingers drumming lightly on the table. "Chloe is just trying to understand, honey. She only wants to help. You know how sensitive people can be about expectations." Expectations. That word carried the weight of a century of disappointment. In this family, expectations weren't suggestions, they were verdicts. Fail to meet them, and you were not just a failure, you were a stain, a reminder of imperfection in a house that lived for perfection. I pressed my lips together, forcing myself to breathe slowly. I could feel the heat in my neck rising. My father's eyes were on me as always, calculating, critical, waiting for me to crack, waiting for me to validate their years of judgment. "And you, Imani," Chloe continued, ignoring my silence, "you really do have such unique style. I mean, that suit is interesting." Her lips curved, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile that pricked at your skin like a nettle. "It's professional, yes, but it doesn't exactly scream success, does it?" I could feel my face heat, the old familiar sting of shame rising from my chest to my jaw. 12 years of these micro-assaults, 12 years of measured cruelty masked as concern, and it never got easier. It never stopped hurting. My mother leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, though the volume carried for the entire table. "You know, Imani, it's important to present yourself. Look at Marcus. Look at Chloe. Look at this table. This is what success looks like." Her eyes swept over me, over my simple but impeccably tailored suit, and I saw the comparison laid bare, my life, my choices, my achievements, all reduced to insignificance by the sheer weight of their curated perfection. My father snorted quietly, muttering, "She wishes she could get a secretarial job," his tone dismissive, yet entirely fitting with the pattern of judgment my life had been measured against. I felt the tension in my chest tighten, a familiar burn that had accompanied every family gathering for as long as I could remember. I clenched my fists under the table, my nails digging into my palms to remind myself that I was still alive, still standing. I was the family failure, yes, but I was here. I had survived the judgment, the derision, the constant weighing of my worth against my brother's flawless image. And tonight, that mattered. The main course arrived. Lobster, perfectly steamed, a vivid red against the pristine white of the plate. The smell was intoxicating, but I barely touched it. My attention was fully on the conversation, on the eyes, on the calculated glances. Chloe smirked, delighted by my restraint, by the visible tension she had elicited. My mother smiled too, satisfied with the performance of dominance she had orchestrated. Marcus laughed, clapping his hands once in amusement. I took a slow breath, letting the cool air of the restaurant wash over me. Yes, they could judge me. Yes, they could ridicule me. But this was still my space, my life, my choices. And while I sat silently, absorbing their attacks, a quiet defiance began to simmer beneath the surface. A thought that had been dormant for years stirred awake. Maybe I wasn't the failure they wanted me to be. Maybe I had value they couldn't see, couldn't comprehend. Chloe leaned forward again, resting her diamond-encrusted hand on Marcus's arm. "You know," she said, voice dripping with false sympathy, "I just hope you can handle the workload, Imani. It must be exhausting, juggling all of that IT work." I finally looked up at her, steady, unflinching. "It's not exhausting," I said. "It's fulfilling. And it's mine." The words hung in the air like a spark before a fire. My mother paused mid-sip, her painted lips slightly parted. My father raised a brow, intrigued, though he didn't speak. Marcus's smirk faltered, just a fraction, as if he hadn't expected this pushback. In that moment, the table shifted, the air changed. I realized that tonight, for the first time in years, I wasn't just the family failure. I was a living, breathing contradiction. I was more than their comparisons, more than their judgments. And though the night was far from over, a small victory had been claimed. One silent, personal, but no less significant. I settled back in my chair, the muscles in my arms relaxing slightly. The battle was far from over. Chloe would continue, my mother would continue, and Marcus would continue. But I was ready. Tonight, I had survived. Tomorrow, at the graduation, I would no longer be invisible. And for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Hope. The night stretched on like a carefully wound coil, each moment a quiet test of endurance. The restaurant had settled into a low hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses and soft jazz weaving through the air. But at our table, tension was thick enough to taste. I sat rigidly, my hands folded neatly on the table, pretending the world outside didn't exist. But my family's scrutiny was relentless, and I felt it in every glance, every subtle shift of weight, every quiet laugh that rang across the table. Chloe had retreated for a moment, leaving her diamond-laden aura of disdain hovering in the air, and my mother Janelle seized the opportunity. "Imani, darling," she began, her voice sweet but sharp. "You know, sometimes I wonder if you understand how much appearances matter." She leaned slightly closer, her perfume overwhelming the scent of the ocean air that wafted through the open windows. "Marcus has worked so hard. Don't you think you should honor him by presenting yourself appropriately?" I kept my gaze steady, focusing on my untouched water glass. "I'm here for Marcus, Mom. That's all that matters," I said evenly. My words were calm, but inside, a storm raged. 12 years of judgment, of whispered and not-so-whispered criticisms, had built a familiar fire in my chest. A fire that now glowed quietly, promising a reckoning I had long suppressed. My father, David Hayes, sat at the head of the table, a figure carved from authority and expectation. He watched me with the measured patience of a commander observing a trainee, ready to act at the slightest sign of weakness. I had always known his eyes could pierce through me, seeing not just who I was, but who he had expected me to be. I forced my shoulders to relax, resisting the urge to shrink under his scrutiny. Marcus, ever the golden child, leaned back in his chair, smirking. He had always been the one to bask in our parents' approval, their pride shining like armor around him. I envied him once, but now I only felt the need to prove, silently, internally, that my worth wasn't defined by their approval. My job, My life in DC, my quiet independence, all of it mattered, even if they couldn't see it. Chloe returned, her blue eyes scanning me with subtle calculation. "You're very persistent," she said, her tone almost admiring, if faintly condescending. "I imagine it must take a lot of effort to keep up with your unique career path." I suppressed a laugh. "It's not about keeping up," I said, finally lifting my eyes to meet hers. "It's about doing something that matters to me. That's the difference." Her smirk faltered for a split second, and I allowed myself a small internal victory. My mother's smile tightened, a sign that she had sensed the shift, the crack forming in the carefully constructed hierarchy she relied on so heavily. Janelle, ever vigilant, redirected the conversation toward Marcus. "Marcus, darling, tell everyone about your day at training. I'm sure your sister here would love to hear about the real demands of the SEAL program." Marcus laughed, loud and confident, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension. "Training was brutal, Mom. But that's what makes it worth it. Every obstacle, every challenge, it's designed to break you. And you either let it or you rise above. Kind of like life, right?" He glanced at me, his smirk tinged with something almost smug, as if to remind me that the narrative of perfection belonged to him. I nodded politely, hiding the coil of emotion inside me. He was right, in a sense. Life was about rising above, about proving oneself. But his success didn't diminish mine. It simply existed on a different plane. And for too long my family had tried to measure me by Marcus's standard. Tonight, I would no longer allow that. The lobster arrived, glistening and steaming, a crown jewel of the meal. I picked at it mechanically, the flavors barely registering as my mind processed the patterns of control and judgment around the table. Chloe, sensing the silence, leaned in again. "I do hope you understand, Imani, that we don't mean to be harsh. It's just concern. For your future. For your standing." I held her gaze steadily. "I understand perfectly," I said, my voice low, firm. "And I also understand that my life is mine, not a performance for your approval." There was a brief pause. The table shifted, the air thickening with a mixture of surprise and quiet discomfort. Janelle's eyes flicked to my father, perhaps expecting him to intervene, to scold, to remind me of my place. But David Hayes merely raised a brow, observing, waiting for the storm to settle. Marcus's smirk was replaced by curiosity, a flicker of intrigue crossing his otherwise smug expression. For the first time in years, I felt the tiniest surge of something I had long denied myself. Pride. Pride not in the approval of my family, but in my own composure, my own assertion of self-worth. They could try to diminish me, but they could not define me. Not tonight, not ever again. As dessert was served, chocolate mousse and candied citrus, the conversation turned to Marcus's upcoming graduation. Everyone was talking over each other, celebrating, speculating, complimenting. Chloe's earlier attacks had faded, replaced by a careful monitoring of my demeanor. I realized she had underestimated me. They all had. My mother's voice cut through the chatter, light and precise. "Imani, darling, it's important to support your brother. Don't let past difficulties cloud the evening." I smiled faintly. Not for her, not for anyone, but for myself. "I'm here to support Marcus," I said, my voice carrying the weight of finality. "That's all I intend to do." There was a subtle shift at the table. My presence was no longer a silent invitation for judgment. It was a statement, quiet but unmistakable. I existed. I was capable. I was more than the shadow of their expectations. And in that moment, I felt a strange, exhilarating freedom. A sense that no matter what came next, Marcus's graduation, Chloe's continued disapproval, my mother's subtle manipulations, I had already claimed a small victory. I had endured, silently resisted, and for the first time, allowed myself to feel the strength I had cultivated over years of quiet perseverance. The night continued, conversations ebbing and flowing, laughter and compliments mingling with the occasional sharp remark. But inside me, a quiet fire burned. I was ready for whatever lay ahead. Tomorrow, at the graduation, I would no longer be invisible. I would step into the spotlight in my own way, and my family would finally see, not the failure they had insisted I was, but the woman who had survived their scrutiny and emerged stronger for it. And for the first time, I realized something terrifying and exhilarating at once. My life didn't need their approval to be extraordinary. The night had begun as a test, but now it had transformed into a battlefield. Every glance, every word, every movement around the table felt like a calculated strike. I sat in my chair, back straight, hands folded neatly in front of me, pretending that I was nothing more than a spectator. Yet, in reality, I was acutely aware that every ounce of my being was under a microscope. My family had spent years crafting their narrative. I was the failure, the disappointment, the cautionary tale. And tonight, as the dinner edged toward its final courses, that story hung in the air like a thick fog. Chloe had resumed her subtle assaults, her tones soft, measured, but razor sharp. "I just hope the work isn't too overwhelming, Imani," she said, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It can be demanding. Long hours, constant problem solving. It must take a toll." I looked at her directly, forcing calm into my tone. "It's challenging, yes, but I enjoy it. I wouldn't trade it for anything." Her smirk wavered, and I felt a small, private satisfaction. She hadn't expected resistance. She hadn't anticipated that the girl they'd all written off could respond with composure. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly, an almost imperceptible twitch betraying her irritation. She had expected me to wilt, to apologize silently, to confirm their narrative of failure. My father, David Hayes, cleared his throat, a low, deliberate sound that silenced the table instantly. Every head turned toward him, sensing the weight in that single sound. In civilian clothes, he still carried the presence of a Navy senior chief, a man whose voice commanded rooms, a man whose judgment had haunted my life since I was a child. "Enough," he said, his words measured, precise, cutting through the tension like a knife. His eyes locked onto mine, unwavering, assessing. "You come here, on the eve of your brother's greatest achievement, and you bring this sour attitude." My chest tightened. I opened my mouth to protest, to explain that I hadn't said anything, hadn't tried to disrupt the celebration. "Dad, I didn't—" "You didn't have to," he interrupted, his voice rising slightly, resonant, leaving no room for argument. "You sit there in a cheap suit with a sour face radiating bitterness. Disrespectful, not just to me but to the family, to your brother." The nearby tables glanced over, startled by the sudden intensity, but my father didn't care. He never did. His attention was singular, fixed on me. His words were not a casual rebuke. They were a verdict, delivered with the precision and finality of a commander passing judgment on a recruit. I forced myself to stay calm, to breathe, to remember that this was not a battle I could win with confrontation alone. "I'm not being disrespectful," I said quietly, though the tremor in my voice betrayed the heat in my chest. "I came to support Marcus." "David." Hayes leaned back slightly, his gaze still fixed on me. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive, the weight of his judgment pressing down on my shoulders. I could feel the tension radiating from my mother, from Chloe, from Marcus. Everyone was watching, waiting for me to crack, to cry, to apologize, to validate every insult they had ever thrown my way. Janelle, sensing the shift, tried to regain control. "Imani, honey, you just don't understand. It's about presentation, about respect, about honoring your brother's achievement. Her words were sharp, rehearsed, a defensive shield for the family's constructed reality. I held her gaze, finally letting my own voice rise, low and steady. I do understand, Mom. I respect Marcus. I respect what he's accomplished. But respect isn't about appearance. It isn't about matching your definition of success. It's about recognition for the effort and the dedication someone gives to what they choose to do. The table went quiet. Chloe's smirk faltered. My mother's painted smile tightened, turning brittle. Even Marcus's smirk softened, replaced by curiosity, a flicker of uncertainty that I hadn't seen before. For a moment, the narrative of the failure daughter hung in suspension, unclaimed by anyone. David Hayes's eyes softened just a fraction, but his voice remained commanding. You've grown teeth, Imani. I'll give you that. But remember, this is still about the family, about respect. Do not let your pride overshadow the celebration of your brother. I nodded once, deliberately, letting the acknowledgement be both submission and defiance. I would not erupt in anger, not here, not tonight. But internally, I was alive in a way I hadn't been in years. This was the first time I had stood my ground without being crushed by their expectations. Marcus broke the silence with a chuckle, a teasing edge to his voice. Well, sis, it's not every day you stand up to Mom and Dad. I'm impressed. His smile was genuine, though tinged with the usual arrogance that came from being the golden child. I allowed myself a small, private smile in return. The dessert arrived, a decadent chocolate mousse garnished with candied orange peel, and the waiter placed it before us with careful precision. I barely touched it. My focus was elsewhere. This dinner, this confrontation, was not about food. It was about identity, about reclamation, about survival in the environment that had defined my life for too long. Janelle, realizing her verbal assaults had lost their potency, shifted tactics. Imani, darling, you're very strong-willed, she said, her tone tinged with caution now. But remember, strength must be tempered with humility. I met her gaze, steady, unflinching. I've learned humility, Mom, but I've also learned that strength doesn't have to be hidden. For a long moment the table remained silent. Chloe's eyes flicked between me and Marcus, clearly calculating what had just happened, trying to understand the shift in dynamics. Marcus's expression was unreadable, his golden child confidence tempered by the realization that I was no longer entirely within the orbit of their judgment. I leaned back in my chair, the fire in my chest cooling slightly, replaced by a simmering sense of accomplishment. I had navigated the storm with composure. I had asserted my worth quietly, but unmistakably. And I had survived the verdict of my family, who had always defined me as less than enough. The night drew to a close, the celebration of Marcus's impending achievement continuing around us. But for me, something had changed. I was no longer just the family disappointment. I was a living contradiction, a challenge to the narrative that had suffocated me for decades. I had survived the dinner unbroken, and tomorrow at the graduation ceremony, I would step into the world not as their failure, but as someone who had claimed her own place, on her own terms. As we left the restaurant, the cool ocean breeze hit my face. I inhaled deeply, tasting the salt and the freedom in the air. For the first time in years, I felt it. The quiet, undeniable truth that I was capable, that I was enough, and that no one, not Chloe, not my mother, not even my father, could take that from me. Tomorrow, the real test awaited, and I was ready. The morning air in Coronado was crisp, filled with the scent of salt and the faint tang of early sunlight reflecting off the bay. I stood at the edge of the crowd, tucked behind uniformed officers and families, trying to disappear. My charcoal gray suit felt heavier than it had at the dinner, as though every fiber had absorbed the weight of 12 years of judgment. Marcus, my brother, the golden child, would be graduating from Bud S, the Navy SEAL training program that had consumed his life for the past 2 years. I had thought tonight would be just another test, another performance for my family's judgment. But as I glanced at the admiral preparing to commence the ceremony, a strange sense of anticipation twisted in my stomach. The crowd murmured with excitement. Families clutched cameras, friends whispered congratulations, and somewhere near the front, Chloe hovered, radiating the same sharp disdain she always did. I tried to shrink into the back, to be invisible, to let the ceremony pass without incident. After all, this was Marcus's moment, not mine. And yet, as the admiral's voice rang out over the formation, something extraordinary happened. His eyes, scanning the crowd, locked onto mine. The world slowed. I felt the air compress around me, and suddenly, all the chatter and movement of the crowd fell silent. My family froze. My father's jaw dropped. My mother's carefully constructed smile faltered. Even Marcus's confident posture stiffened, a subtle shift that betrayed his surprise. "Colonel," the admiral's voice cut clearly, loud enough for the entire formation to hear. "What are you doing back here?" The salutation that followed was precise, formal, and entirely unexpected. The admiral walked straight past my family, stopping before me, locking eyes in a gesture of recognition that felt as heavy as a spotlight. He raised his hand in salute. The sound of it, the crisp, exact motion, echoed in the stillness of the morning, and I felt a wave of disbelief wash over me. My father's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. My mother's eyes widened, the pearls she wore seeming almost to tremble. Chloe's hand clutched Marcus's arm, her expression frozen mid-expression, a perfect capture of shock and incomprehension. For 12 years, I had been invisible. The failure, the dropout, the daughter who could never measure up. And in this moment, a man of authority, someone outside the confines of family judgment, acknowledged me. Not as a failure, but as an accomplished, respected professional. The crowd murmured, cameras shifted, people whispered, "Who is she? Why is she here?" But I didn't hear them. I only felt the piercing clarity of recognition, validation, and the quiet vindication I had carried silently for over a decade. "Imani Hayes," the admiral continued, his voice firm and commanding. "Your dedication and service have been exemplary. It's an honor to have you here today." The world tilted slightly. The words didn't just land, they reverberated. My father's expression flickered between disbelief and awe. My mother's eyes narrowed, trying to contain a storm of emotion she didn't know how to process. Marcus looked at me, eyes wide, unguarded, as if seeing me for the first time, not as a sister who failed, but as a person of merit and presence. I swallowed, my throat tight. All the dinners, the subtle insults, the comparisons, the dismissals, they culminated here, in a moment of undeniable truth. I was not defined by their perceptions. I was not the cautionary tale. I was more. I had been more all along. The ceremony resumed, the SEAL graduates marching in precision, the colors waving proudly. But my attention remained on the acknowledgement I had received. It was small, brief, a single salute, a single recognition. But it shattered a lifetime of invisible chains. As Marcus's name was called, he stepped forward, confident, polished, the embodiment of years of training and expectation. But this time he looked at me. His usual smirk softened, replaced by a complex mix of pride and uncertainty. He had always measured himself by his own accomplishments, by the approval of our parents. But in this moment, he had to reckon with the fact that I had carved a path of my own, one that did not intersect neatly with his. When the ceremony concluded, families streamed forward for pictures, hugs, congratulations. My father's hand hovered near my shoulder, unsure whether to reach for me or retreat. I stepped forward, meeting his eyes directly, holding the silent defiance and pride that had built over years. "Imani," he said finally, his voice low, rough with emotion. I didn't see. I didn't see it all these years." I nodded once, letting the words stand as acknowledgement, not as apology. I didn't need it. My life, my worth, was no longer contingent on recognition from them alone. I had earned it elsewhere. I had claimed it for myself. Chloe, ever poised, tried to maintain composure, but the flicker of surprise and unease betrayed her. She could not control this moment. She could not dictate my worth. Marcus hugged me afterward, his strength tangible, and I felt the bond of siblinghood, complicated and fractured, stretch and reshape itself. "You did good, sis," he said quietly, almost reverently. "I didn't realize." "It's not about realizing, Marcus," I said softly, smiling. "It's about doing." And I did. The crowd began to disperse, families congratulating graduates, officers shaking hands, the morning sun climbing higher. And I stood there, breathing in the salty air, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face, finally unburdened by the weight of their judgment. For 12 years, I had been their failure. 12 years of whispers, of comparisons, of quiet torment. And now, I was visible. Not for them, not for their approval, but for myself. The admiral's salute, my father's stunned silence, my mother's faltering control. They were all symbols of a truth I had carried silently for too long. I was capable. I was worthy. I was more than anyone had ever expected. As we walked away from the ceremony, Marcus beside me, my parents trailing, Chloe lingering behind, I felt a profound sense of liberation. This wasn't the end of judgment or the last insult, but it was the first time I had stood in my own light, fully seen, fully recognized, fully free. And for the first time in my life, I smiled. Not politely, not defensively, not as a shield, but purely, utterly, as the woman I had always been, unbroken, undeniable, and entirely myself.